This is part two of the look at the burdens of proof and the affirmative defenses, and I want to say a few more words about entrapment. Sort of got cut off when I hit my 15 minutes, and I have on the screen now the defense of justification, so I'm going to want to say a few things about that as well. But just to finish, entrapment, sort of to sum up, it is typically a defense that is very difficult to establish. One has to show not only that the state used methods to lure a person into committing the crime, but the methods were such that a person who really wouldn't have committed the crime would have committed the crime if they had been exposed to the methods. At the very end, I was talking about the possibility that some of the time there's a concern that the government, in trying to investigate what it perceives to be crimes among political groups, could actually manufacture crimes. On the other hand, one perhaps is glad that some of the time, at least, the government investigates certain groups, and I'm thinking about the arrest of individuals over the summer based on evidence obtained from an undercover agent, where a so-called militia group, mullets and all, planned to kidnap and probably murder the governor of the state of Michigan. So I want to turn now to the defense of justification, and the defense itself includes some items, that we really aren't going to look at. Our focus is on the essential part of the defense of justification, which addresses situations when physical force and deadly physical force can be used to defend persons and property. And we have on page 3 of the material I posted on justification, I think a helpful table that kind of sums up the various rules. But before we scroll back up, before we look at that, we want to look at the definitions and the distinction between physical force and deadly physical force. And essentially, deadly physical force is physical force which, under the circumstances it is used, could cause death or other serious physical injury. Notice the language under the circumstances in which it is used. So sometimes the same amount of force will be either deadly physical force or just physical force, depending on the circumstances. If you were to shove me lightly in the back as I stood in the center of a room, I think we all would agree that that would be physical force. On the other hand, if you shoved me lightly in the back as I stood on the edge of the Grand Canyon, I think, would conclude the same amount of force under those circumstances would be deadly physical force. But that's our definition and distinctions between physical force and deadly physical force. And then as we look at the table, which again I think is concise but also complete, I want to point out this idea where you see the asterisks, reasonable perception and reasonably necessary. So let's just look at physical force in defense of persons. Let's assume that a 10-year-old kid walks up to me and starts to hit me. Well, I would be under the reasonable perception that that child is using unlawful physical force against me. He surely doesn't have any legal right to come up and start hitting me. Could I use physical force to defend myself? Sure, but the amount of force I would use has to be what's reasonably necessary. So I couldn't like punch the kid in the head. I would have to use that force to kind of subdue him, which let's hope wouldn't take much. But we have that idea of reasonable perception and reasonably necessary. And just one further point on the reasonable perception. If you recall, we earlier looked at when can mistake of fact constitute a defense, and that was under section 20.20 of the penal law. And when we looked at that, we realized that one category was mistake of fact can support a defense of justification. So it may be that someone comes up and is threatening me with unlawful physical force, like they're just about to hit me, and I defend myself, and it later turns out the person was playing a joke. If my perception that the person was about to use unlawful physical force was reasonable, even if it was mistaken, my mistake of fact would support the defense of justification. So that's what we were talking about. Now, another point I'd want to make is in the category of deadly physical force. And a couple of observations. Generally speaking, when you look at those categories of when can deadly physical force be used, I have it as defensive persons. Now, you might say, well, burglary of a dwelling or occupied building or arson is, you can see those, are really crimes against property and not crimes against a person. On the other hand, if you take some time to consider those categories, you would, I think, agree with me that our concern, if we have burglary of a dwelling, which is like where you live, as an example, the concern is not so much for the property involved, but for the safety and welfare of the individuals on the property. And let me just illustrate that. If in the middle of tomorrow night you wake up to the sound of someone walking through the first floor of your house, and you start to very carefully walk down the stairs and see a complete stranger in your living room, I'm going to suggest that your concern at that point isn't for some property that you may have in the living room. Your concern is going to be for your welfare and the welfare of other individuals who are present at that time. And the law recognizes that concern for personal safety and permits, if there's a reasonable perception and if it's reasonably necessary, the use of deadly physical force to prevent that particular type of burglary. I want to move up to duty to retreat. And the duty to retreat is in play if a person claims that their use of deadly physical force was for the purpose of defending themselves or a third person. And in New York State, as in other states, there's the rule that says if you can retreat with complete safety to yourself and others, then you have to retreat rather than to go forward with the use of deadly physical force as a defensive measure. Other states don't have the duty to retreat under any circumstances, and in those states we sometimes say that the laws in place are stand your ground. The other point I would want to make about the duty to retreat is in the case that I posted for you, People versus Aiken. And there, the defendant was at the doorway of his apartment, and the court said, under the circumstances, he wasn't justified using deadly physical force because he could have simply stepped into his apartment and closed the door. And in making that ruling, the court looked at the language, duty to retreat except when at home, and they said the defendant was not in his home or residence when he used deadly physical force, again, but was at the doorway and could have retreated into the house. Had he been in his house, or I think it was apartment in that case, had he been actually in the apartment and a guest, let's say, was threatening him with unlawful deadly physical force, then he wouldn't have had a duty to retreat. The other and final point I think I'd make about deadly physical force, and I'm pointing to the category forcible rape or criminal sexual act, kidnapping and robbery. The reason there's a separate category there is because those crimes can be committed without the perpetrator using or threatening to use deadly physical force against the defendant. The victim, without using deadly physical force against the victim. However, if you consider the dynamics of those crimes, the fact is, and I think this is the language I use in the posting, in a nanosecond, in an instant, the perpetrator of a forcible rape or of a kidnapping or a robbery could begin to use deadly physical force. And the reason for this category then is that the victim or someone coming to the aid of the victim doesn't need to wait for the threshold of deadly physical force to be used in the commission of the crime, given the huge potential for deadly physical force to be used when those crimes are committed. And at the outset, so long as there's a reasonable perception, and again it's reasonably necessary, deadly physical force can be used. I think that's where we'll call it a day right now for looking at the defensive justification.